Hello, everyone. I think that if everyone wants a nice long lunch break and craft making, we should get going. I hope you enjoyed your coffee break and you're raring to go with the next delicious offering. So I'm chairing this. My name is Christine Morris, and I'm the head of Histories and Humanities in Trinity College Dublin, which is very proud to have the Centre for Gender Women's Studies as part of it. So I'd just like to say how delighted and proud we are and honoured to be hosting a day about Brigit in Trinity College Dublin. And a couple of people have said how glad they are to come in, so it's our absolute pleasure to do that. And it's my job to introduce our next two speakers. And I suppose everyone says people don't need much introduction, and they really don't. So they are Mary Condren and Catherine Lawless. And of course, Mary will be known to pretty much everyone in the room, I think. She's the director of Women's Spirit Ireland, which is the co-organiser with Gender Studies here of this particular event. And of course, she's been organising Brigit events for, I think, at least 20 years. 30, okay. The website's out of date, so I'm counting up wrong. So, and she's also a research associate with the Centre for Gender and Women's Studies at Trinity. And again, we're delighted that she's been teaching and inspiring our students on our taught masters in that since 1994, if the website's correct. And with my other sorts of hats on, my work is around goddesses, but not in Ireland, in the Mediterranean. But I'm so inspired to hear about goddesses, saints, women's spirituality in here in Ireland, and I've always found so inspiring Mary's book, The Serpent and the Goddess. It's one of my go-to books about feminism and divinity, and we're all very much looking forward to more books that I know Mary's been working on over a long period of time about Brigit, so there's nobody better to hear from on this subject than Mary, and I believe it's going to be a trilogy of books. So that's what you have told me that in the past. I'm not making it up. Anyway, so that is really wonderful. And then Dr. Catherine Lawless is the director of our Centre for Gender and Women's Studies, and she's an art historian who specialises in late medieval and Renaissance art, and with particular expertise and interest in sort of wholly gendered bodies, male and female, I think, as she's got a wonderful range of scholarly articles in edited volumes and journals which reflect those interests. And so we're turning from the more textual and archaeological that we were treated to before coffee to materiality, to iconography and art. So if I could ask Catherine first to come up and get things going. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christine. Sorry, I keep losing my text. I'm probably going to have to go without it because it keeps not downloading. So I'd like to thank Mary Condren for asking me to speak today, for commanding me to speak today. And I first of all should say that I work on Italian art. And unfortunately, I work on Florentine art, and unfortunately, Brigit isn't found in Florentine art. So that was my first challenge, to establish a corpus of images of Brigit with the help of iconographical dictionaries and so on. And again, I didn't really find that much. This surprised me because Brigit was venerated in the Florentine church from very early on. Her feast day was celebrated in the Florentine church from the earliest calendar we know, and likewise in the Sienese church. So I might come back to that as I talk. What you're looking at here is a French illuminated manuscript of around 1300, where you can see she is, I don't know if I've got a pointer, I don't think I do. So anyway, you can see her there just with the cow. her attribute of the cow. And you can see that she's been really depicted as a generic nun, really. So she's got the crozier and the cow. And we'll see that being repeated, particularly in Northern European iconography, as we go through. So, yes, technology. Sorry, Eleanor. I don't have it on, that's what's happened. Oh, there is a pointer. No, there isn't.
You've just switched to the next slide.
That's good. Thank you. That's what I wanted to do. Thank you. So this is another manuscript later this time. It's around 1420, a book of hours, possibly from Bruges, now in the New York Pierpont Morgan Library. And so, as Idel mentioned, the cult to Brigid in Northern Europe is particularly strong, particularly around Belgium, France, Brittany, which I'll come back to, the Cologne area, Alsace-Lorraine. And here again, we have her as a generic nun, leading the cow, holding the book and holding the crozier. Now, the book is a symbol of her learning. So, I mean, that's in a way a standard iconographical attribute for any abbess that you find in European art. What distinguishes her here is, again, the cow from her legend. Otherwise, her iconography is fairly indistinct. Now, next one. This is an interesting one, and I don't know enough about it, but I'm going to do further research into it. This is the Book of Hours of the Duke of Bedford, and it's in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And as you can see, you've got a sequence of scenes from the life of Brigid, moving from the bottom of the page up to the top, focusing on the episode of the cow and the miraculous reproduction of the milk. Moving through to episodes of piety, and up at the top you have charity. Now, what Brigid was doing in a manuscript of the Book of Hours of the Duke of Bedford, I don't know. And that's something, and he was terribly involved in French politics and in the war between the King of France and the Duke of Burgundy. So I think there could be some political significance here, but I simply can't comment any further on that. It's very difficult to find out anything about it. But it is interesting, and it is interesting also that she is not just generically depicted, or not just in an initial, or not just because it happens to be February, but in actual fact you've got that deliberate little sequence of scenes. So quite a lot of attention given to an Irish saint in this Book of Hours. Now, one of the reasons I think in Florence and in Tuscany more generally why Brigid doesn't appear in iconography is, I think, because of the importance of those other feasts at the beginning of February, which are in a way liturgically related. This is a picture by Ambrogio Lorenzetti of about 1342 of the Purification of the Virgin. And this was an altarpiece in Siena Cathedral. The purification, the Feast of the Purification of the Virgin was really important in Tuscany. And it, Candlemas, people would go to the church and they would get their candles, their own, their candles or their tapers and so on, blessed on that day. I think that the importance of that feast, plus the feast a few days later, which is that of St. Agatha, on the 5th of February. I think in a way those two feasts eclipsed the Feast of Brigid. Although there are relationships that I'll come back to between, I think, the Purification of the Virgin, as Idel mentioned earlier, St. Agatha and St. Brigid. St. Agatha, Sicilian virgin martyr, who had her breasts cut off as part of her torture. And when her breast when she's threatened with having her breast cut off, she says to the tyrant, "Oh, impious tyrant, how dare you cut off that which suckled you when you were a child?" So I think that emphasis to the nourishing nature of the breast and milk connects the cult of Agatha. And I'm sure, I know it's controversial, but I'm sure Agatha is a Christianized version of some older antiquity. And so I think that emphasis on the milk is really interesting, connects the Feast of St. Agatha to the Feast of St. Bridget and the purification of the Virgin, the great nourisher, the great breastfeeder of the Christ child. And another connection that I think is important is fire. St. Agatha is protectress against fire. And she stops Mount Etna erupting and stops, volcanic eruptions and so on. And the way in which her feast was connected to the purification of the Virgin in Florence, in Siena, and in Cremona, just to name 3 cities, and I'm sure there were many, many other cities that had this ritual as well, was that the candles that were blessed on the Feast of the Virgin, on the Feast of St. Agatha, were brought in procession in front of an icon. This is the icon that was used in the procession in Florence of St. Agatha. And these candles and the icon of St. Agatha and relics, if they had them, were brought to all the 4 parts of the city, the cardinal points of the city, in order to protect the city from fire. And I think that that's a really kind of interesting way in which these 3 feasts are related: milk, fire, purity, and of course, 3 female saints, divinities, if you will, in this protective function. And I think that this is possibly one of the reasons why, naturally, an Italian saint is going to have more traction in Florence and Siena. And of course, the cult of St. Agatha would be older in those parts than the cult of Brigid. Another reason why Brigid is, I think, not represented that much in Florentine art, or I'm going to be honest, at all, not that I could find anyway, is that Donatus of Fiesole, who wrote, he was an Irish bishop of Fiesole, who wrote a life of St. Bridget, that cult rapidly becomes subsumed in the cult of St. Donatus himself, and also his successor, St. Andrew of Fiesole, another Irishman, whose sister was Brigid. And according to this legend anyway, his sister is miraculously transported to him on his deathbed. And I think that that cult gets more traction than the cult of Brigid, although of course the 2 are intimately related in mythical terms. Where Brigid is found is this extraordinary fresco cycle by Lorenzo Lotto in Trescore near Bergamo, the Oratorio Suardi, it's called. And on one side of the wall you have, I'm sorry, I can't point, but on one side of the wall you have Christ as the vine, the miraculous vine, with the vine leaves coming out of his arms and stuff, and they're going up to various roundels of saints and patriarchs and so on. In the background, alongside Christ, is the life of St. Barbara, and St. Barbara was a protectress against thunder and lightning, a virgin martyr whose life is pretty similar to all the other virgin martyrs, gets tortured horribly and ends up dying. But on the other side, you have the life of St. Bridget. And this is extraordinary in the amount of space in an Italian church given to St. Bridget. And I have found very little about it. Most of the scholarship on this fresco cycle focuses on Lorenzo Lotto and on his brushstrokes and on his this, that, and the other, and not that much on the iconography. I think it's the cult of St. Bridget of Ireland, insofar as it exists in Italy, exists in the north of Italy. In the Veneto, in Lombardy, in Piedmont. So, she's not unheard of in those parts, but still it is a fair amount of attention being given to her. That's Christ the vine with the roundels and so on. And this is the life of St. Bridget. You can see that she is, I've lost my text again, I'm sorry, this wretched thing. She is here. This is the veiling of St. Brigid, again referred to by Adele this morning. And it's a completely Italianate scene. I mean, you know, we wouldn't expect Lorenzo Lotto to know anything particularly about Ireland. So what he's done is transpose the story into an Italian landscape with lovely Italian classical architecture and so on. You know, you have the veiling of her here. She's in this kind of whitish robes. I don't know if that's a reference to a contemporary order. It's not quite like the Camaldolese robes or Cistercian, not quite. Probably kind of an imaginary habit, really, that he's put. He's focused on the veiling, which I'll come back to. The charity of St. Brigid here with the pails of milk and her giving things to beggars and probably healing there as well, beggars and lepers. In the background, she's tending the flocks and protecting them from the fox, preaching over here, and over here more scenes of her charity. So really charity is the key thing that he's looking at. But the veiling here, I think, refers to a little bit more. I think that this is probably referring to the orthodoxy of St. Brigid, in which she is receiving the veil from the bishop. And the reason I say that is because the patrons of the fresco, Maffeo and Battista Suardi, had some shady associations at the time with Lutheran groups. And they were suspected of Lutheranism, i.e. suspected of heresy. So what better way could they reinforce themselves as Orthodox than to show the line of command, the episcopal line of command, the Roman line of command, by showing Brigid receiving the veil from the bishop. So it underlines the apostolic authority of the church. And these are the details that I was talking about. They're beautiful frescoes, really, really lovely. I'd love to see them. One of the things that we'll find is that we will find the iconography of the cloak being explored by artists. We will find the iconography of the cow being explored by artists. One of the things we do not find is the belt. Or the girdle, and I think that's very interesting, but I haven't found much evidence of its celebration in art. So I'm going to move now quickly to the early modern period, where we have, this is the Florilegium Insulae Sanctorum, Sur Vitae et Acta Sanctorum Hiberniae, which was put together by Thomas Messingham, who was an Irish priest in Paris in the 16th century. This plate here, where you have St. Columba, St. Patrick, and St. Brigid, this was engraved from a drawing that he did. So really, he's putting the three patrons of Ireland, or establishing and labeling the three patrons of Ireland here. But the generic iconography of the nun is just used for Brigid. There's nothing particularly, I think particularly exciting about the image there. And moving into the 19th century, we find the same. This is the life of St. Brigid as part of the Young Christians Library, printed in Dublin by James Duffy and Co., 1880 to 1908. Now, James Duffy was a prolific publisher of Irish devotional material. And I think he could be seen as a strong arm of what was known as the devotional revolution, which was ultramontanism, the idea that the Irish church had to be brought very firmly back into line with Rome. This is particularly under the auspices of Cardinal Paul Cullen, who feared that during the sort of wilderness years of the suppression of Catholicism, that the Irish church had gone in two bad directions. One was towards Protestantism, The other, which I think for Cullen was even more dangerous, was towards what he thought was paganism. So he was trying to eradicate things like holy wells. He was trying to eradicate private masses in houses or masses on the hilltops of Ireland and so on, and trying to bring them into established male sacral ecclesiastical space. And, you know, so this kind of literature that was being produced, we can see it's not surprising that she is just the generic nun here, totally in line with the ideals of the Roman Church, and interchangeable with any number of other nun saints. I mean, I haven't looked it up, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Duffy using the same plate for St. Teresa or someone else. I think it's very... Well, in my research for this paper, I found this terribly interesting painting on the White's database. White's, the auctioneers of Irish art. They have a very, very good database of everything that they sell. And this was an allegory of Hibernia painted by Frédéric Le Grip. And this was for a priest of the Irish College. I've forgotten his first name, I'm afraid, but his second name was Quinn Lacroix. He was a native of Rouen, but presumably had some Irish ancestry from the name. And he was professor of French in the Irish College, and then later the administrator of the Irish College. And he commissioned this work of art, where you can see Hibernia, the poor tortured Irish figure wearing the green, possibly a reference to the belt here. It's an enameled, jeweled belt. And she's invoking the three patrons of Ireland, which have been handily collated by Messingham and Duffy and others, Patrick, Columba, and Brigit. She's actually directly touching Brigit. I can't quite work out what she's taking from Brigit. It would be nice to think that she's taking light from Brigit or fire from Brigit, but I can't quite work it out. But I think the figure of Brigit and the figure of Hibernia are collated and mapped onto each other in some way as well, because of the prominence of the cloak, the prominence of the green outfit that she's wearing, the light that is coming around her. And then, of course, you've got the round tower and the cross, the Celtic cross and the round tower and the wolfhound down here. I've no idea what that lion-like creature is on the other side, so I'm going to move on from that. As part of this devotional revolution, you have stained glass, and some of the most, I think, exquisite pictures of Brigit occur in stained glass. This is mass-manufactured stained glass by Meyer of Munich, which was a firm that really pumped it out in the 19th century. And this is St. Mel handing the crozier to St. Brigit. It's in Killarney Cathedral, which was designed by Pugin as part of the Gothic revival. And I think, again, you can see orthodoxy at work here. You can see the hand of Cardinal Cullen. You can see this kind of, orthodoxy of Brigit being subordinate to the bishop here in the green cloak with the lovely light. This is a bad photograph, it's the best I could get, but a bad photograph of the exquisite Harry Clark stained glass window in the Honan Chapel in UCC, where you have Brigit here in this beautiful blue. And I have a detail which is slightly less of a horrible photograph. And you can see that, she's holding her abbey. That is the cow around her. The angels above, I think, are kind of holding a cloak. I'm not quite sure. It's exquisitely detailed. There are oak leaves and so on intertwined in all the kind of interlacing around her. And Harry Clark himself was a symbolist painter, and he was very much involved with the writings on the continent of Theosophy. And he was a follower of Kandinsky. And Kandinsky wrote about how blue was the most spiritual color that you could get, that blue was the color of our eternal peaceful repose. So I don't think it's an accident that Brigit is put in this really, really exquisite and beautiful blue, because Clark was so well aware of the writings of Kandinsky. This is, I just put this in for interest because this is a drawing that we have here in Trinity College in the manuscripts collection by Harry Clark's father, Joshua Clark and Sons, which was the firm of stained glass workers for Sandy Mount, Our Lady Star of the Sea, where you can see Brigid and the cow there. Whether she would have been coloured in further, we don't know, but that's the Evie Hone of the On Tour Glyna studio, which is the Tower of Light studio, where you've got, again, I'm not going to dwell too much on any of these because they are quite difficult to see, but I just wanted to put them in to give you an idea of some of the richness of the imagery. And I thought this was a nice one to include by David Essler, of St. Patrick, St. Brendan, St. Ferdomnach, sorry for my pronunciation, it's probably wrong, St. Columba and St. Brigid, from 2003 from Armagh, from the Cathedral of St. Patrick, the C of I Cathedral of St. Patrick, because it's in memory of Archbishop George Otto Sims, who's the father of Dr. Catherine Sims, who's done so much work on Brigid. And of course, Dr. Catherine Sims is married to Kim McCone, who's done so much work on St. Brigid. So I thought it was quite a nice thing to sort of, having found it, to bring in. We can see her there on the, sorry, I wish I had a pointer, but you can see her on the, I know if I say left, I'm going to get it wrong because I can't tell my left from my right. So now I wanted to kind of go back to this mapping idea of one saint onto the other, into the Virgin Mary. As I said, the cult of Saint Brigid was very strong in Brittany. And you have there also the cult of Saint Anne, which is very strong. This is Saint Anne Trinitaire, which is Saint Anne holding the Virgin and Child. So you can see the Virgin and then the Child, and Saint Anne embracing them, and her cloak is almost kind of embracing them like that. And both, as I think, Anne, is the inheritance to Christianization. I mean, she's a totally fictitious saint. There's no mention of Anne in any of the scriptures. St. Anne emerges from the Apocrypha. And I think it is a Christianization of an older cult. Both Brigid and Anne have these strange legends in Brittany about their origins. Both their Breton legends say that Brigid was transported from Brittany. They kind of don't say it, well, Mary would correct me on this, but I think that she's transported from Brittany to the Holy Land, where she is a midwife, or she attends the birth of Christ. And I think that's very interesting because St. Anne is also seen as a native of Brittany. Our legend, says that she was a Breton princess who was married to a very cruel lord who refused to allow her to have children. She miraculously becomes pregnant with the Virgin Mary, and angels transport her to the Holy Land, where she gives birth to the Virgin Mary. And then she's transported back once Mary marries Joseph and lives out the rest of her life in Brittany. So I think that there's interesting overlaps between those two saints, which I didn't know until Mary asked me to do this, and I want to investigate further. This is a Breton sculpture of Brigid as midwife. I've no idea how to say that, Brigit. It's Breton, but anyway, Brigid is holding the Christ child here. I think that's a really interesting image. Know nothing about it apart from finding it. Then I'm going to move to the paintings of John Duncan, who was a symbolist painter from Dundee in Scotland. And he painted this really beautiful image, I think, of the transportation of Brigid being carried by angels to the Holy Land. Really, really, I think, exquisite. He connects her, in painting anyway, to the Scottish tradition. The sea and the islands there are related to Iona and the Hebrides. And the seal probably has some kind of reference to the Selkie tradition as well. Duncan was fascinated by Celtic myth and mythology and painted a great deal of it. I have no idea how I'm doing for time. Not much left. Grand, cool, I'm nearly finished. Okay, another Saint-Anne Trinitaire, where I just wanted to talk about the cloak. The cloak enveloping the Virgin and Child. And I think that kind of protective image is interesting. And maps onto the Virgin of Mercy, the Madonna della Misericordia, whose cloak protects the laity from all sorts of things, including plague. This is St. Anne, Virgin and Child, and you probably can't see it, but God the Father above is hurling down arrows of the plague, which are bouncing off St. Anne's cloak to protect the people below. This is in our own college collections. This is Kathleen Verschoyle, St. Brigit. Beautiful, enveloping motion of the cloak. Oh, sorry, Christine, did you want to take that? I don't know if I can get back to it. Sorry. Patrick Tuohy, a beautiful image, I think, of St. Brigid, really, really strong and powerful in these lovely red robes, holding a gorgeous jeweled book against the kind of the dead tree of winter behind her. Sainte Brigitte in popular culture, that's in a French newspaper. I think it's 1956. Patron saint of Ireland in Strasbourg, poster for only 2019. Festa di Santa Brigida di Irlanda in Piacenza, one of the places where there was a church dedicated to her from medieval times. Mass stock ecclesiastical furnishings where this generic thing comes across where she's actually been given the cord of St. Clare, highly inaccurately, I think. John Duncan again, The Coming of the Bride, and I just want to conclude with Judy Chicago's dinner party, where St. Bridget is included as part of the Saints and Sages part of this fabulous feminist project, where famous women from history are invited by Judy Chicago to the dinner party, and each woman is given her own place setting, and it's a reincorporation of women that had been forgotten into the history, into the historical tradition, and also into the art historical tradition, into visuality, into visibility. And the plates were all kind of Volvic images. And you can see here that you've got the fire, spring, the green leaves, and so on for St. Bridget. And I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
So I should have said at the beginning, we're going to go straight now into Mary's talk, and then there'll be time for questions for both our speakers after that. Thank you, Mary.
Timer up there. Thank you all for coming again to our event. And I just want to say that my name has been mentioned many times already, and I could not have organized this event without the enormous help given primarily by Leah O'Hegarty, who is somewhere around, she's probably, God knows where she is anyway, she's around there somewhere. But I just want to acknowledge her specifically. And I also want to say that there are many people in this room, and you all know who you are, so I'm not going to take the risk of naming you because I'll forget somebody, and then I'll be in trouble. But there are many people in this room who have contributed to Women's Spirit over the years, over many, many years, and without whom none of this could have happened. So I just want to say that when you hear the name Mary Condren, I'd rather you say Women's Spirit, because we are a collective. And that has been the reality. Now, I've never used one of these clickers before. Also, I just want to say, and maybe this is a bit personal, I'm wearing a mask, not because I have a virus, because I can't afford to get one. Okay, so you can come up to me, but that's the reason. I won't give you the virus, that's what I'm trying to say. Okay, before I start the slides, I just want to say that I thought I knew something about Brigid. I had written The Serpent and the Goddess 30 years ago, and I had resourced and organised festivals of Brigit for 20 years, and a publisher said to me when I was writing a different book, for God's sake, Mary, would you not get out a book soon? And I said, I know something about Brigit. I could do that in 3 months. That was 10 years ago. And, you know, Edel used, if I can remember the name, not stratospheric, stratigraphic, yes, that's it. Brigit is stratigraphic, because once I began to get into the topic, I realized it was absolutely enormous. So all we can do today is, and in any other time, is to show you some of the clues to understanding who Brigit might have been in the past, what she is today, and what she might mean for the future. My focus today is going to be on the material artifacts. When we started the Brigit Festivals 30 years ago, only Noreen is here from the original group. We literally said, there was Barbara Callan, who's now dead, unfortunately, Imelda Smith, and Caroline Keogh, who are not with us today, but we literally held hands. Noreen will agree to this. And somebody said to me, Mary, I really wish I could do whatever it is you want me to do, if only I knew what it was. And all I could do was laugh, because I hadn't a clue what was going to happen. But I just knew that when we kind of held hands with Noreen and whatever, that the creativity would come up. And it did, inevitably. It came up from cellular memories of the people who came to these events and who told the stories. And that was hugely important. And the reason I'm telling you that is I've learned a great deal of Brigit, both from reading the text that Edel has kindly offered us, but also from the immersion in the living traditions and the kind of responses I've got to Brigit when, for instance, I resourced festivals of Brigit in Canada for 7 years. And I brought the kris, and I brought the cloak, and I brought all the usual stuff that I would be bringing to these things. But it wasn't until somebody said, when I started using the kris, and I said, I'm not quite sure what this is about, but this is what we do with it. And a woman said, Mary, if I was a midwife in Africa, and I could not have practiced as a midwife unless I had my girdle. And that to me was the beginning of a whole other journey into understanding the reality of Brigit. So today, all I can do is give a little snapshot of some of the material artifacts that we have used, and some of the things that I found out about them in the meantime. Now, I'm not even sure where I'm starting today, but I'm hoping if I click this thing, something will happen. Oh, yeah. The cloak, I'm going to briefly talk about the cloak, the crosses, the kris, the girdle, the importance of dew, of bread, honey, and milk. And they are all things that we use in our rituals of Brigit. I'm going to start with the cloak. This thing works great. The cloak is the most ancient symbol of divinity throughout the world. I prefer to use the word divinity rather than goddess for this reason. And I'll just tell you one thing. I had an article that was supposed to be published in the Irish Times this week. It was pulled at the last minute. And because one of the senior editors thought it was too hard to read. Now, this was not Patsy McGarry, so don't blame Patsy. I don't know who it was completely anonymous. But when this is over, I'm going to send it out to all of you so that you'll have it, because otherwise I don't know where it's going to end. But in that article, I distinguished the various layers of divinity, because I was very anxious that people are using the word goddess very loosely, and I thought it needed to be explained. I distinguished between panentheism. Panentheism is energy. Energy is the nyart. And in the most ancient features of divinity, of religion and spirituality, energy was represented by images of regeneration, like the serpent and the bee and the bull and other kinds of animals. And the Cailleach, for instance, was the old Irish symbol of divinity, and she would not want to be named. She didn't leave her traces when she moved from one place to the next, and that was her position. And so even in some of the other stories, like Macha and Maeve, they didn't want to be named, because naming petrified the image, and that image was not to be petrified. Divinity was not to be pulled down to earth. It was always a mystery. Now, we move to the next level, which was henotheism. And henotheism is it's not sacred, it's loric, L-O-R-I-C. It's related to place. In other words, there's a guardian of that place, an old guardian, and those old names are still all over Ireland. But the guardian of that place would be responsible for guarding and protecting that place. But they were confined to that place. They made no universal claims. The third one is polytheism. Now, we find polytheism primarily in the ancient manuscripts. We have goddesses like Maeve and Macha and all of those kinds, and Boan and whoever, who came from earlier traditions. But polytheism is another level of divinity. It's when divinity starts to be brought into the political fights. In Ireland, certainly, even Brigit was brought into some of them, but more broadly in the world at large, that women or female divinities were brought in to legitimate the ambitions of political empires, and we find that particularly in the classical sources. Finally, in the monotheistic religion, Brigit becomes a saint. Okay? So now when we organize our festivals, I didn't put all this up on my thing because I just got carried away, so you have to tell me when I shut up, Christine. When we organize our festivals, we have people coming from all places. Like in Canada one night, there was a brilliant scene. There was a coven of witches who used to come every year. The whole coven would come. And then there was an 85-year-old Irish nun who had emigrated to Canada, and I got somebody to take a picture, because there the two of them were dancing at the Cayley, which we had on a Saturday night. And that, to me, epitomized the spirit of Brigit that we were trying to cultivate, that Brigit is not a weapon to be used against anyone, but somebody who will bring people together in the common search for integrity and spirituality. Now I'll shut up and get on with the thing. There's an image of the Cailleach. The Cailleach has a cloak. Like when you ask people in teachers in school, what you know about Brigit, well, it's all about, she asked a rich man for land, and the man and spread the cloak, and that covered the Curragh of Kildare. That's a very domesticated image of the cloak. The cloak is actually the primordial symbol of divinity, and it's related to the Cailleach, who went around all over Ireland dropping stones, and the stones of Lough Crew in particular are related very clearly to the Cailleach. But they're all over. In the Irish sources, we will find, what on earth is that? Oh, the cloak collects the dew of the earth, yeah. Okay, sorry. On the eve of Brigit, we put out the cloak, and the cloak collects the dew of the earth. And in the ancient traditions, the dew was the most sacred fluid. Right across the old Europe, the dew is a sacred fluid. Whereas in our society, the blood shed in martyrdom or death or in killing somebody else, that's the sacred fluid, which is a radical change of imagery and symbolism. I'll return to the dew in a couple of minutes. The uses of the cloak, the cloak has many different uses in the Irish literature, and it's not specific to Brigit at all. It keeps enemies apart. It makes people forget if they had a big trauma. Cuchulainn and somebody had a fight, and Manannán came and shook his cloak, and they forgot everything. So it was like an instant reaction to trauma, healing trauma. It's also the cloak of invisibility. And like I said, there are many different uses of that. It's also, as Catherine has pointed out, the cloak, this is the Virgin Mary, and it's the cloak of mercy. In that sense, Brigit is the figure who embodies the Christian and the Hindu and the Buddhist and the Jewish cry of the prophets, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So the cloak is the cloak of mercy. And you can see there in the way the Virgin Mary embraces everyone, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female. And that is the image that represents that, whereas the altar of sacrifice divides between the good and the bad, the pure and the impure, male and female, ba-dum-ba-dum. We won't go on. This is Sarasvati, the Indian figure, which I got from Nandini. Thank you, Nandini. And this also, in the Hindu tradition, absorbs the dew of the earth. And in the there's another image of Mary. And in the Chinese tradition, there we have the Kuan Yin. And she collects the dew, and then she pours it over her petitioners. It's the dew of mercy. So again, these are universal symbols. They're not specific to Brigit, but we have unique cellular memories here in Ireland that is our responsibility to share now with the rest of the world. And that's another image. I love this one because it's like, it reminds me of what Jesus, when he was looking over Jerusalem, he said, oh my God, I wish I could, cover you like a hen covers her chicks. Again, it's the image of the cloak, which is very Christian in that sense, but which has been lost in the tradition. Now we come to the cross, and again, when we started using the cross, we weren't altogether sure what it might mean. And again, Christine, I can give you the PowerPoint, or don't worry about having to make photographs. We can give you the PowerPoint. It goes back to the Kaliak. The cross is what some people call the eye goddess. And in the traditions of Brigit, there's a story of somebody asked the Kaliak, who made the world? And the Kaliak said, I haven't a clue. Go on and ask the eagle. And off she went and asked the eagle, or he went and asked the eagle. And the eagle said, I haven't a clue. Go down and ask the badger or something. And the badger says, well, I haven't a clue, even though I've been lying on this rock for years. And he said, go down and ask the salmon. And so he went down and asked the salmon. And the salmon says, well, I'll tell you, I know about the beginning of the world. The beginning of the world happened when I was lying in the ice, and a big bird came and plucked out my eye, and the blood melted the ice, and that was the beginning of the world. Now, there are similar stories told in the northern traditions and in many other traditions around the world about Odin losing an eye. And in Brigit, again, this is, on the one hand, you can read the stories about Brigit's marriage and taking the veil as a very Christian thing against marriage or sex or whatever. But in reality, once you read the different versions, and Edel spoke of the earlier versions, the later versions were a little bit looser because Christianity had gained a hold at that point, and therefore more of the ancient traditions came into the later versions. But in all of them, you'll see that when she takes out her eye, and the blood goes on the ground, and it creates a well, or all the rushes grow around it. And so the well and the rushes and the tree and the cross, they're all connected. They're all part of a symbolic economy that we need to recuperate. There we are, blood dropped on the ground, and there's the rushes. And we have loads of rushes this weekend now to make your crosses with. That's another one made with beautiful rushes. We weren't sure that we'd have them, so therefore we brought the pipe cleaners. But you can use both. I've never made a cross with rushes. I'm hopeless at doing it. At every well, you'll also find the tree of life. So the tree of life also relates to the crosses. It's a very rich form of symbolism. But around the world, the eye goddess is also represented by the crosses and eyes. That's the Spanish version. This is a Syrian version. And this is the eye of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess. Okay, and now we come to the Chris. Now again, as I said, I knew nothing about the Chris when we began. And that's a traditional Chris ritual. There you'll see, I don't know who this is, but they're putting it over the woman, and there's a cross at the edge. Now, again, I've learned a great deal in the meantime, I hope. There's a traditional Chris with the 3 crosses. What could this possibly mean, or where could it have come from? There's the belt of Orion. Now, I'm not somebody who knows a great deal about astronomy, but the 3 buttons there are found, again, on ancient artifacts, again, throughout the world. And somehow there's some sense of alignment. Because the rituals that we celebrate at the seasonal festivals are not about worshipping. They're not about worshipping anything. They're about trying to be in alignment with our bodies, with our communities, and with the cosmos. And so there are some clues there that we still need to work on to try to find out what exactly was going on and what it means. So in the lives of Brigit, it is said that she gave her girdle to an old woman to help her earn a living. The old woman came and said, listen, I'm really very poor, and can you help me out? Brigit wanted to give her a cow, and she said, that cow would be no good to me. Somebody would just rob it. So she gave her the girdle. Now, when you come to something like this, the Moylach Shrine in the National Library, you think, now, what is that all about? It looks very beautiful and very ornate, and it's put in this shrine. But the interesting thing is that the important thing is not the shrine. The important thing about the Moylach Shrine is what is inside it. And what's inside it is an old, ancient leather belt. I've never seen it because I haven't had the nerve to go into it and said, listen, open the shrine, let's have a look. But apparently it belongs to a Connemara saint. At least that is the suggestion, that it belongs to a Connemara saint. And as we go into the further, the belt could represent the serpent as an instrument of healing. That's an image of how we use the kris in our ritual ceremonies, which we'll be doing this evening. There's the Virgin Mary, who, okay, I think this is the one. I'm not sure this is the one. This is the one. St. Thomas doubted that Mary had been assumed into heaven, just as he had doubted that Jesus had risen from the dead. So what did Mary have to do? She had to come back. And in order to persuade Thomas that she had in fact assumed into heaven, she dropped her girdle and gave it to him. So that was the importance of the girdle. And here, horrifically, in some ways, given what's happening in Russia today, that is the image of the Holy Belt of Mary. And just a couple of years ago, this was put on show, and thousands of people came to see the Holy Belt of Mary. So, when we use the kris, we haven't really a clue of the richness and the tradition and the international symbolism surrounding it. Now, that's the Thomas and Mary one. Sorry, I got a bit confused there. This is a very, very ancient image. This comes from the Vinca Mound in 5,000 years BC. And you can see there, this is a picture from a book by Maria Gimbutas. And you can see there that the belt is around the trunk, and the three buttons are very clearly, that photograph is not a great one of it, but they're very clearly in the book on that. And there's another one of the serpent belt used in Mexico. And again, the belt is wrapped around somebody who has died. And again, the belt symbols regeneration. And that's a kind of a way of saying, we hope you might rise again, or you hope you might be regenerated again in some way. Now, this image is really interesting. This comes from the Native American tradition. And again, they're using a belt. See, the woman is holding onto the belt there to pull as she is giving birth. Again, there are many more traditions that I could tell you about. The belt is used when a woman can't expel a fetus, and she could die if she doesn't expel the fetus if it has died within her womb. And there are many stories that the saints have been called to come and bring their belt and help her to expel the dead fetus. It's also used to protect a woman's virginity or to encourage fertility. It's used to loosen or to tighten at various stages of pregnancy. So it's a hugely important item of regeneration. And again, in these ancient indigenous traditions, regeneration is focused or stressed much more than redemption. And again, because redemption belongs to the blood shed in sacrifice, and of course women are not allowed in there, regeneration is a different matter altogether. Okay, so in our Women's Spirit Ireland ceremonies, which we have developed over the many years, we use the cloak for containment. The cloak becomes a kind of womb, not literally, metaphorically, that holds the group together, enabling us to celebrate with some kind of integrity. The night before, the cloak is placed outside to absorb the dew of mercy. And then it's brought back in for the final ritual. We cut it up, and then we give pieces to everybody to bring home to their sick relatives. There was a great story at one of our first events in Esker in Athenry. A woman said, oh, she knew all about the cloak because her granny used to keep little chickens and birds. And she used, whenever a bird was sick, she'd wrap a little piece of the brath around the bird and put it down her boobs and keep it warm, because that was the warmest place she could remember, she could think of. And that way she healed her little birds. So, okay, and what we do also, we can learn a great deal, by the way, from reading the text on Brigit. And one of the things that Brigit did not do, there's a long text of, this is what Brigit did not do, and of course I read it backwards. She must have been doing that if they took so much trouble to tell us what she didn't do. And so what Brigit did not do, she never washed her face or her hands in water. And so that's, doing that is the preparation for a shamanic ceremony. So of course we wash our faces and we dip our hands in the dew if we can find it, deliberately in order to recuperate the tradition of ancient Brigit. We use bread, because bread is the elementary food of the earth. Bread, ovens, the word oven and ovary are very, very similar. And again, in old Europe, all of the ovens were shaped like the womb. So pregnancy, fertility, yeast, all of these are interrelated. There's one particular image of a bread oven. We use honey in honor of Gobnet, who is the Brigit of Munster, and her bees. And I've only recently begun to understand the richness of the Gobnet traditions in Ballyvourney, but they are absolutely stunning. And one of the things I'm finding, and Edel might have more to say about this, is there are different traditions of Brigit all over Ireland, and I think that they reflect the different people who came to Ireland at different times. The Gobnet traditions bear traces of the Middle East. And in particular, they seem to replicate the conditions of the Garden of Paradise. Now, I won't go into that any further because it's very, very complicated. But I'm just saying that, in the work, and I've been at this for 10 years now, I'm only scratching the surface of what is there. And what I really would be wanting to urge you today to do in your own areas, interrogate your grannies, interrogate your grandparents, interrogate anybody who's around there who still remembers those traditions before they're forgotten forever, as it were, because they're too valuable to be lost to us and to be lost to the rest of the world. And finally, we use milk in our ceremonies, and this is to symbolize our purity of intention. Because when we go through the Kris, we're making a sacred covenant almost to say, the question we're going to be asking in our ritual this evening is, what would it mean for us to walk in the spirit of Brigit? And so we'll be reflecting on that. And then when we take the bread and the honey and the milk, and then we go through the Kris, we are committing ourselves to walking in the spirit of Brigit for today. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Oh, careful. Thank you so much. I mean, both of you, so much food for thought, wonderful images, things to think about and to think about the experience of the ritual and so on. Thank you both for sharing all of that. Now, we're not quite running to time, so what I suggest is that we have time for a few questions. I'm sure people are bursting with questions, but we'll keep it to within 10 minutes. And then we'll break for lunch and come back on time at 2:15, when there's going to be some more wonderful singing, music, and then more talks. So if that's all right with everyone. Okay, first question. Everybody.
Okay, thank you both. One of the symbols you have not spoken about, either of you, is the crochet. Now, the crochet was used with women's saints right into the Middle Ages. My reading of history is usually explained as having the same power as the bishop, as the male bishop. But I wonder, did it have a different, and maybe a very different symbolism? And it's interesting in some of the ones you showed us, Catherine, where the crochet was taken away completely in the images from the 17th century and the 19th. So what's the crochet about?
I think that is really interesting, yes. Abbesses abbesses held croziers. It was part of the symbolism of being an abbess. So in that sense, it's not incongruous. But I do think that probably, certainly in the 19th century, it's not the kind of authority that someone like Paul Cullen would have liked women to hold. So I think that, that might be... Idel, can you... Yeah, great. Knows more about crochets than I do.
I was just going to ask you a question which links with that about the wonderful frescoes in Bergamo, or near Bergamo, that in the Counter-Reformation, and I think you were saying these people who commissioned it, there was a possible Lutheran, and in the Counter-Reformation, and especially in Messingham, she is very much depicted as a Counter-Reformation nun. So she's no longer an abbess as such. She is Teresa of Avila, as you said. So she loses the crosier.
Yeah.
So it's a Counter-Reformation.
Yeah. I think that's very interesting. And I think that exactly ties to...
I think John McCafferty has written about this.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yes,
I must look at that. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. I think it's really interesting, and I think, she also becomes much more generic, interchangeable with any other Counter-Reformation. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I think. Well, I don't think that the Counter-Reformation Church much wanted empowered women. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
If I can just comment again on the crosier, I would have a little bit of a different take on it. And I started to develop this thread from an old Irish saga, which is called the Second Battle of Moytura. And it's a long story, so I won't go into all the detail, but there is a point at which Brigit is, at that point, a secular figure, and she is part of the Tuatha Dana, as some people call it. And she and the women were asked to elect a king. And they said it would knit our people together if we asked Bress to be the king. And Bress, in that saga, was her husband. And to make a long story short, it all ended up very badly, because she was betrayed by her husband, she was betrayed by her son, she was betrayed by whatever. And Tommaso Cahasi, a brilliant scholar in Harvard at the moment, he wrote a great article about it. He said the whole point of the saga was to tell people that women should stick to their knitting. Because the image of knitting came up right at the very beginning. And Adele, you showed a beautiful platter, or a batten, a weaving batten. The image of weaving is all the way through the old European iconography, because the whole point of the religions of the hearth, and I think that's what Brigit represents, she's a religion of the hearth versus religions of empire. And the religions of the hearth are always talked about, she's, it's the lower orders. Well, I have to say to the women in this room in particular, and probably most of the men, we are all of the lower orders, and be grateful that we belong to the lower orders, because we have something now very different to offer, because our role is to weave together rather than bash people with a crosier. Thank you.
maybe just to weave something into, just to add a little bit, just Catherine, you were talking about the cloak of mercy. And it is said that Brigit took the beatitude, blessed are the merciful, when she was taking the veil. So that's, a link there. And just a link really with our beloved Seamus Heaney from Mary, maybe you know it already, but he has a lovely poem in the collection of Crossings, his poetry collection Crossings, which describes how a woman steps into the Chris and how a man steps into the Chris. So that's just a lovely piece of poetry. That's all I want to say. It's not a question.
Hi. Does Brigit symbolise the transition from a kind of nomadic way of life to a farming, pastoral way of life, or is that too confining?
Yeah, I think there are many layers of Brigit, and in many of the images and many of the stories, she represents the hunter-gatherers. But in some of the and you see, the stuff about slavery is also very interesting, because as far as I know, Brigit's mother was also a member of the Futter. Now, I might be wrong about that, but she was a slave. And so my hunch is that many of the hunter-gatherers were made into slaves when, farming and private property and agriculture became dominant, and those who were the traveling people, what we call the tinkers, they were left homeless. They were left, without land, without anything. And so Brigit, in the written traditions, has an ambivalent attitude as a saint. But if we go into the hunter-gatherer symbolism, or the gatherer-hunter symbolism, which is more correct, there's a lot to say that her traditions would have arisen from those sources, and particularly, some of the. Adele mentioned the relationship between the Cailleach and Derlu Daka, which is also a huge enigma, and I'm hoping that you will, unpack that even further. Because I've been relating, Brigit, much more to the Cailleach, particularly in relation to the traditions of Scotland, where the Cailleach is in charge of the first half from November to May, and then in May, at Glenlyon in Perthshire, they have a shealing, and they bring out the Cailleach and her husband, who's the Bodach, which literally means penis, and they've been hibernating all winter. And the final one they bring out is the Innim Bui, who's the daughter of Bui, which is the daughter of the Cailleach. So it's mind-boggling once we start unpacking those relationships, particularly in the ritual traditions. And many Celtic scholars are very scathing about the nature cults or the ritual traditions, but I happen to find them very interesting and extremely suggestive. But we have to understand them, the layers of hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, as we go on. So that's a very important part of separating out the stratigraphy. Did I get it right this time? Stratigraphy, thanks to Jem.
Thank you both for your presentation. I really like that in both the presentations there was this comparative standpoint that were taken with other female divinities that exist all over the world. I come from India, and there's I could so much relate with the cloak, the Saraswati collecting the dew, or Parvati having the third eye with the creos and with the cloak. And that's something I've always wondered with my study when I'm fascinated with Brigit as well, that do we really need to understand Brigit, and I think it's coming up now especially, that do we need to really understand Brigit not only in isolation in context of Ireland, but maybe developing a deeper analysis of her by comparing it to other female divinities that exist all over the world, because that's also a way of reclaiming the female genealogies of divinity that has been existing all over the world, and in matriarchal cultures a lot as well, which is a different field of study, and has been strategically wiped out by the monotheistic and the patriarchal takeover of religion. So that's my question. And if yes, what also will be the drawbacks of doing that?
Well, 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, my answer is yes, it needs to be done. Yes, there are drawbacks. But I'm hoping, I don't know whether I told you this already, I'm hoping to persuade, let's say, partners, and maybe Trinity will be interested in doing this, in organizing an international event. In the future. Now, Woman Spirit has no money, by the way, just to let you know that to begin with. We start from zero. Our events are self-financing. Nobody is paid, so just to let you know that. We have no money to begin with. We're hoping, maybe, I am hoping anyway, and I know some others are hoping it too, that maybe we'll have an indigenous, a larger international gathering comparing the indigenous traditions. I don't know how it's going to happen, where we're going to get the money from, but I'm just putting it out there. Because I think that's what's needed at the moment. When you see the craziness that's going on in Ukraine, the craziness that's going on around the world, we have to get together, and men and women, and radically challenge the social imaginary that is governing the world today. Yeah.
I think that is a very heartfelt and inspiring point to stop. To thank both our speakers, Mary and Catherine, yet again, and to break for lunch. Thank you.